The November fog hung thick over St. Bartholomew's Church in Mayfair, lending an appropriately somber atmosphere to what should have been a conventional funeral service. Lady Evangeline Marchmont, at 71, had been a formidable presence in London society, a woman whose sharp wit and sharper tongue had made her both feared and respected in equal measure. Her sudden passing from heart failure had surprised no one who knew her demanding lifestyle. Yet as the mourners filed past her coffin for their final respects, an unsettling murmur began to ripple through the assembled gathering. Lady Evangeline was smiling. It was not the peaceful expression one might expect from the departed, nor the subtle curve that skilled undertakers sometimes achieve to suggest serenity. This was unmistakably a smile of triumph, knowing, almost mischievous, as though she had just heard the most delightful secret and was savoring its implications. The effect was profoundly disturbing, transforming what should have been a dignified farewell into something altogether more sinister. Sir Reginald Marchmont, her eldest son and heir, stood rigid beside the coffin, his pale complexion made paler still by his obvious distress. At 45, he possessed the soft features of a man more comfortable with ledgers than life's harsher realities, and his gambling debts were an open secret among London's financial circles. His wife, the former Miss Cordelia Fairfax, clutched his arm with white-knuckled intensity, her usually immaculate composure cracking under the weight of that inexplicable expression. Across the aisle, Dr. Marcus Ashworth, Lady Evangeline's younger son, who had disappointed her by choosing medicine over the family banking business, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, studying his mother's face with the clinical detachment of his profession. Yet even his scientific training could not explain away the unsettling phenomenon before him. Miss Violet Marchmont, Lady Evangeline's spinster sister and longtime companion, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether from grief or shock remained unclear. Beside her, Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, appeared more agitated than bereaved, repeatedly consulting his pocket watch as though eager for the service to conclude. The household staff maintained their positions with practiced discretion, yet careful observers might have noted the meaningful glances exchanged between Mrs. Hartwell, the long-serving housekeeper, and Jameson, the butler. Even young Sarah, the parlour-maid, seemed to start at every unexpected sound, her usual composure replaced by nervous fidgeting. As the service progressed, the smile seemed to cast an increasingly oppressive spell over the proceedings. The Reverend Dr. Blackwood stumbled over familiar passages, his voice faltering whenever his gaze fell upon the deceased. Several mourners found excuses to leave early, unable to endure that knowing expression any longer. It was Mrs. Hartwell who first noticed the second disturbing detail. "The brooch," she whispered urgently to Jameson, "the Marchmont diamond, it's gone." Indeed, the magnificent diamond brooch that Lady Evangeline had worn to every significant social occasion for the past 30 years was conspicuously absent from her funeral attire. The revelation sent another wave of unease through the gathering, for who would dare rob the dead, and how had such a theft gone unnoticed during the preparation of the body? Mr. Pemberton approached Sir Reginald with obvious reluctance. "There is the matter of the sealed letter," he murmured. "Your mother's final instructions were quite specific. It is to be read immediately following the service, in the presence of all family members and principal staff." Sir Reginald's face darkened. "What letter? You said nothing of this before." "She delivered it to my office only 3 days before her death, with strict instructions that it remain sealed until this moment. I confess, the timing seems prophetic." As the final hymn concluded and the mourners began to file out, that triumphant smile continued to haunt their thoughts. Lady Evangeline Marchmont had clearly taken one last secret to her grave. Or perhaps, more unsettling still, she had left behind a revelation that would prove far more devastating than her death. The mystery of the lady who smiled at her own funeral had only just begun, and it would require a mind of exceptional brilliance to unravel the threads of deception that seemed to emanate from that knowing expression. Fortunately, among the mourners that day was Captain Arthur Hastings, whose association with a certain Belgian detective would soon prove most fortuitous indeed. The journey from St. Bartholomew's to Marchmont House passed in uncomfortable silence, the fog seeming to muffle not only sound but conversation itself. Captain Hastings found himself walking alongside the other mourners, still disturbed by that inexplicable smile and the mystery of the missing brooch. As they approached the imposing Georgian facade of the Marchmont residence, he noticed a small, impeccably dressed figure emerging from a waiting taxi, adjusting his overcoat with characteristic precision. "My dear Hastings," said Hercule Poirot, peering at the damp air with profound disapproval. "The English fog, it offends the sensibilities. Also, it is most disagreeable to the moustaches." "Poirot!" Hastings exclaimed with genuine relief. "However did you— but of course you could not have arrived more opportunely. The strangest thing has occurred at the funeral. Lady Evangeline was smiling in her coffin, and the famous Marchmont diamond has vanished." The little Belgian's eyebrows rose with interest. "Ah, one smiles for many reasons. Triumph, irony, satisfaction, malice. The dead, they do not smile without purpose. And to remove a jewel from the deceased, this too is a statement of intent. Already, mon ami, I am most intrigued." As they were ushered into the drawing-room of Marchmont House, Hastings quickly explained the circumstances. The heavy velvet curtains cast the room in somber shadows, and the assembled family and staff arranged themselves with the careful precision of people conscious of being observed. Sir Reginald stood near the fireplace, his pale complexion made paler still by obvious agitation. His wife Cordelia maintained her rigid composure, though her knuckles showed white where she gripped her handkerchief. Dr. Marcus Ashworth positioned himself with clinical detachment, while Miss Violet Marchmont fluttered nervously near the window. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat, holding up a heavy, cream-colored envelope sealed with the Marchmont crest. "Lady Evangeline's instructions were explicit," he announced. "This letter is to be read immediately following the funeral, in the presence of all family members and principal household staff." Mrs. Hartwell and Jameson stood stiffly by the doorway, their faces carefully neutral, while young Sarah, the parlor maid, kept her eyes fixed on the carpet with nervous intensity. The solicitor broke the wax seal with deliberate ceremony and began to read in Lady Evangeline's unmistakable voice. "To my dear family and faithful servants, if you are hearing this letter, then my preparations have proven necessary. I have long suspected that my death, when it comes, may not be entirely natural. Therefore, I have taken certain precautions." A collective intake of breath filled the room. Sir Reginald started forward. "Precautions? What nonsense is this?" Pemberton continued steadily. "First, regarding my Marchmont diamond, it was to be buried with me, at my throat, as I have worn it on all occasions of significance. If the brooch is not present as you hear these words, then someone has dared to defy my explicit instructions, and I am not a woman who tolerates defiance lightly." Dr. Ashworth's medical training asserted itself. Mother had been experiencing heart palpitations for weeks. Her condition was well documented. This letter suggests a paranoia that— "Second," Pemberton interrupted, "should there be any irregularity surrounding my death, the slightest suggestion of impropriety, I have arranged for the services of Monsieur Hercule Poirot, whose reputation for solving impossible mysteries precedes him. I trust his little grey cells will prove adequate to the task of uncovering any deception." Poirot stepped forward with a polite bow. "Mesdames, Messieurs, I am Hercule Poirot. Lady Evangeline did me the honor of writing 4 days ago requesting my attendance at this gathering. Naturally, I could not refuse such a request from a lady of obvious intelligence and foresight." Sir Reginald's mouth fell open. "You knew? She planned all this." "Lady Evangeline understood human nature, monsieur. She anticipated that her death might create disorder. Already we observe the truth of her prediction. Poirot's keen eyes swept the room, noting every expression, every gesture. The brooch that should rest at her throat has vanished. Someone in this room has taken it. The question is not who had opportunity, for all of you did, but who had the motive urgent enough to risk such an act. The silence that followed was profound. Each person present began to regard the others with new suspicion, realizing that Lady Evangeline had orchestrated this moment with the same commanding presence she had wielded in life. "Now," said Poirot, adjusting his cufflinks with characteristic precision, "we shall proceed with method. I will examine Lady Evangeline's room and speak privately with each of you. We will impose order upon this disorder, and we will discover why the lady smiled at her own funeral." The drawing-room fell silent as Poirot's words settled over the assembled mourners. Lady Evangeline's posthumous orchestration had transformed what should have been a simple funeral into something far more sinister, and the little Belgian detective now commanded the room with quiet authority. "If I may," said Poirot, adjusting his cufflinks with characteristic precision, "I shall begin by examining Lady Evangeline's private quarters. The circumstances surrounding the missing brooch require most careful consideration. Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps you would be so kind as to accompany me." The housekeeper stepped forward, her composure intact despite the obvious strain. "Certainly, Monsieur Poirot. Her ladyship's rooms have remained exactly as she left them on Sir Reginald's instructions." As they ascended the grand staircase, Hastings following closely behind, Mrs. Hartwell spoke in hushed tones. "Lady Evangeline had been acting most peculiarly in her final weeks, sir. She dismissed young Sarah from her chambers on several occasions, preferring to tend to her own needs, most unusual for a lady of her station. Lady Evangeline's bedroom was a monument to Victorian grandeur, heavy with mahogany furniture and rich burgundy draperies. The air still held traces of her distinctive lavender perfume, lending an almost spectral presence to the proceedings. Poirot moved through the space with methodical precision, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail. "The jewelry case, if you please, Mrs. Hartwell." The housekeeper produced an ornate silver box from the dressing table. Inside, nestled in velvet compartments, lay an impressive collection of gems and precious metals, but the space reserved for the Marchmont diamond remained conspicuously empty. Poirot examined the case closely, noting the undisturbed dust around the vacant compartment. "You observe, Hastings, the outline in the velvet where the brooch rested, and the fine layer of powder that suggests recent removal. Yet the clasp shows no signs of forced entry." He turned to Mrs. Hartwell. "Who possessed keys to access this room?" "Myself, naturally. Jameson as head of household staff, and the family. Members all carry master keys, sir." Poirot moved to Lady Evangeline's writing desk, positioned strategically near the window. The surface was immaculate save for a single sheet of cream-colored paper bearing a few lines in the deceased woman's distinctive handwriting. He lifted it carefully, reading aloud, "The truth will emerge, as truth always does. Those who believe themselves clever will discover that genuine intelligence requires more than mere cunning. E.M." "A philosophical observation," Hastings suggested, "or perhaps something more pointed?" "In Poirot's experience, mon ami, the dying rarely waste words on abstract philosophy. This message was intended for someone specific." He folded the note and placed it in his waistcoat pocket. "Now, Mrs. Hartwell, I must ask you to think most carefully. Did Lady Evangeline receive any unusual visitors in her final days?" The housekeeper's brow furrowed. "There was one incident, sir. 3 days before she passed, a young woman came to call. Lady Evangeline received her privately, which was most irregular. She rarely entertained strangers without proper introductions." "Describe this visitor, if you please." "Well-dressed, but not of the usual society circle, sir. Dark hair, perhaps 30 years of age. She carried herself with confidence, yet there was something desperate about her manner. She remained closeted with Lady Evangeline for nearly an hour. And Lady Evangeline's demeanor afterward? Most agitated, sir. She remarked that some people mistake kindness for weakness, and that she had no intention of being taken advantage of. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Most illuminating. Now we shall speak with the family members individually. Truth, it has many faces, but only one is genuine. They returned to the drawing room, where Poirot requested the use of the morning room for private interviews. Sir Reginald entered first, his hands buried in his pockets like a schoolboy summoned to the headmaster. "Monsieur," Poirot began pleasantly, "your mother possessed a magnificent diamond. Its disappearance will cause considerable difficulty for the estate, known?" Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably. "The insurers will make a frightful business of it. Look here, Poirot, you cannot suppose that I suppose nothing. I merely observe and inquire. Your debts, they are substantial?" The colour drained from Sir Reginald's face. "I had intended to discuss the matter with Mother. She was immovable on such subjects. The codicil Mr. Pemberton mentioned would surely have made matters worse." "You visited your mother's body in the parlour before the funeral?" "Yes, to pay my respects. It was difficult. That smile was most unsettling." "And the brooch? You observed it then?" Sir Reginald hesitated fractionally. "I believe so, though my mind was occupied with other matters, naturally." As Sir Reginald departed, Poirot made a note in his small leather book. The investigation had begun in earnest, and already the careful facades were beginning to crack. Each interview would reveal another layer of deception, another motive, another secret that Lady Evangeline had taken to her grave, or perhaps, more accurately, another secret she had deliberately exposed through her final, masterful manipulation. The lady who smiled at her own funeral was proving to be as formidable in death as she had been in life. As Sir Reginald's footsteps faded down the corridor, Poirot made precise notations in his leather book, his pen moving with the methodical precision of a surgeon. The eldest son's hesitation regarding the brooch had not escaped his attention, nor the telltale flush that accompanied questions about his financial difficulties. Yet experience had taught him that the most obvious suspect rarely proved to be the guilty party. "Lady Cordelia, if you please," Poirot requested of Mrs. Hartwell, who nodded and withdrew to fetch the next interview subject. Lady Marchmont entered with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to society functions, though her usual poise showed unmistakable signs of strain. Her black mourning dress bore the quality of Bond Street tailoring, and her auburn hair remained perfectly arranged despite the day's distressing events. She seated herself with careful composure, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap. "Lady Cordelia," Poirot began with courteous formality, "this has been most trying for the family. Your mother-in-law was a woman of strong character, n'est-ce pas?" "Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, Lady Evangeline made no secret of her opinions on any subject." Cordelia's voice carried years of accumulated tension. She felt that Reginald could have made a more advantageous marriage, someone with greater financial resources to offset his tendencies. His gambling debts created family discord. Lady Evangeline threatened repeatedly to disinherit him entirely if he could not demonstrate fiscal responsibility. A note of desperation crept into her carefully modulated tone. "The estate represents our only hope of financial stability." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "The Marchmont diamond, you observed it clearly during the funeral service." Cordelia's response came without hesitation. "Certainly." There was a distinct gleam at her throat as the coffin passed. Lady Evangeline was never without it for formal occasions. Hastings, who had stood directly beside Cordelia during the service, frowned slightly but remained silent. Poirot made a careful note before continuing. "The mysterious visitor Mrs. Hartwell mentioned. You were aware of this person?" "I may have glimpsed someone leaving through the servants' entrance that afternoon. A young woman, though I could not see her face clearly." The response came too quickly, too rehearsed. After Cordelia's departure, Dr. Marcus Ashworth entered with the measured stride of a practicing physician. At 42, he possessed the lean build and steady hands of his profession, yet there was something restless about his manner that suggested inner turmoil. "Doctor," Poirot began, "your medical opinion regarding your mother's death, it was natural." "Absolutely." Mother had been experiencing cardiac irregularities for several weeks. She refused specialist consultation, claiming doctors were charlatans. A bitter smile crossed his features. The irony was not lost on me. Your relationship with Lady Evangeline was strained. She never forgave me for choosing medicine over banking. In her view, I had abandoned duty for the sake of treating common ailments among the lower classes. Years of accumulated resentment colored his voice. She made her disappointment abundantly clear. The interviews continued with methodical precision. Miss Violet Marchmont entered like a pressed flower, her faded blue eyes darting nervously about the room. She clutched a damp handkerchief, twisting it continuously between trembling fingers. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "this is all so dreadful. That smile, it was just like Evangeline, always having the last word. Your sister confided her concerns to you, mademoiselle? She spoke of feeling watched, of plots against her, and she was particularly vexed by that young woman who visited. Evangeline was furious afterward, muttering about people who mistake kindness for weakness." The staff interviews proved equally illuminating. Jameson maintained his butler's dignity despite obvious strain, confirming that he had personally supervised the placement of the brooch before the coffin left the house. Young Sarah, summoned last, entered with frightened eyes and clutched at her apron hem. "The morning of the funeral," Poirot asked gently. "You observed anything unusual?" "Mrs. Cordelia came to the side chapel early, sir. She told me to fetch water for the flowers. When I returned, she had gone, and—" Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought I heard the coffin lid creak just slightly." As the final interview concluded, Poirot sat in contemplative silence. Each family member possessed motive and opportunity, yet their testimonies contained subtle contradictions that suggested deeper deceptions. The mysterious visitor remained an intriguing element, and Lady Cordelia's claim about seeing the diamond from her position seemed increasingly suspect. "Tomorrow, Hastings," he said finally, "we shall visit the church and examine the scene more closely. The truth, it hides beneath layers of deception, but it cannot remain hidden forever." The following morning brought a crisp November air that seemed to clear away the oppressive fog of the previous day, though it did little to illuminate the mystery surrounding Lady Evangeline's triumphant smile. Poirot and Hastings arrived at St. Bartholomew's Church as the early light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the stone floor where the funeral service had unfolded with such disturbing revelations. The Reverend Dr. Blackwood met them at the chapel entrance, his usually robust demeanor still shaken by the previous day's events. "Monsieur Poirot, I confess that Lady Evangeline's expression continues to haunt my thoughts. In 30 years of conducting funeral services, I have never witnessed anything so unsettling. The dead, mon père, they do not smile without purpose," Poirot replied, moving with characteristic precision into the side chapel where the coffin had rested. He examined the space methodically, noting the positioning of the altar, the proximity to the vestry door, and the clear sight lines from various positions within the church. Near the ornate metalwork of the altar rail, something caught his attention. Crouching with sudden interest, he carefully extracted a small fragment of black fabric that had caught on the decorative ironwork. Hastings observed this material. Silk of excellent quality, with a distinctive weave. Someone caught their garment here, very close to where the coffin was positioned. As he placed the evidence in a small envelope, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the church. Inspector Japp strode into the chapel with his characteristic brisk efficiency, followed by 2 uniformed constables, his weathered face bearing an expression of grim satisfaction. Poirot, my friend. I thought I might find you here, poking about with your magnifying glass, Japp declared, though his tone carried its usual grudging respect. Well, you can pack up those little grey cells of yours. The case is solved. Hastings looked up in surprise. Already, Inspector. But how is that possible? Confession, Hastings. A full and complete admission of guilt. Sir Reginald Marchmont walked into Scotland Yard an hour ago and confessed to stealing the Marchmont diamond from his mother's coffin. Japp gestured to one of his constables, who produced an evidence bag containing the magnificent brooch, its facets catching the morning light streaming through the chapel windows. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Indeed. And his stated motive, Inspector? Gambling debts, naturally. Claims he couldn't resist the temptation when he saw the brooch during his final visit to pay respects. Says he planned to sell it quietly to settle his most pressing creditors before the estate could be properly inventoried. Japp's chest puffed with obvious pride in the swift resolution. Even produced the thing from his coat pocket when he confessed. Can't argue with evidence like that. Certainement, the evidence appears most conclusive, Poirot murmured, yet his tone carried a note of thoughtful reservation. However, Inspector, consider the psychology of this confession. A man steals his mother's jewel from her very coffin, carries it upon his person through a day of mourning and family gatherings, yet reveals nothing of his guilt until the following morning. Japp's confidence wavered slightly. Well, guilt works on a man's conscience, doesn't it? Perhaps he couldn't sleep, decided to come clean. Perhaps. Yet observe the convenience of this resolution, all loose ends tied with remarkable neatness. In Poirot's experience, Inspector, human nature rarely presents itself with such tidy conclusions. The desperate gambler who would commit such a sacrilege, would he not seek immediate disposal of the evidence? Would he carry it about like a talisman of his shame? You think someone else is behind this? Japp asked, his investigative instincts beginning to override his satisfaction with the apparent solution. I think, mon vieux, that we have been presented with exactly what someone wishes us to believe. Lady Evangeline anticipated irregularities surrounding her death. She arranged for my presence precisely because she expected deception. That smile, it was not mere death's rigor. It was triumph over those who believed themselves cleverer than she. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Hartwell, who appeared in the chapel doorway with obvious distress. Monsieur Poirot, forgive the intrusion, but there has been another development. Young Sarah, the parlor maid, has disappeared during the night. Her bed was not slept in, and all her belongings are gone. The revelation sent a fresh current of complexity through the investigation. The frightened girl who had whispered about hearing the coffin lid creak had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only more questions in an already tangled web of deception. Most illuminating, Poirot observed quietly. The case grows more intricate rather than simpler, despite Inspector Japp's tidy confession. Sarah witnessed something significant, I believe, and her departure suggests either overwhelming fear or complicity in guilt. As they prepared to return to Marchmont House, Poirot reflected on the morning's developments. Sir Reginald's confession provided a neat solution that satisfied official requirements, yet every instinct warned him that Lady Evangeline's final game was far more sophisticated than a simple theft motivated by gambling debts. The missing parlor maid represented another thread in the increasingly complex tapestry, and somewhere in London, the true architect of this deception believed their masterpiece had succeeded. The lady who smiled at her own funeral was proving to be as formidable an adversary in death as she had been in life. The return journey to Marchmont House found Poirot in contemplative silence, his keen mind dissecting the morning's convenient resolution with characteristic skepticism. Inspector Japp's satisfaction with Sir Reginald's confession struck him as premature, particularly given the psychological profile of a man driven to such desperate measures, yet capable of carrying the evidence through an entire day of family gatherings and police interviews. Hastings, he said as their cab navigated the London streets. Observe the contradiction before us. A weak-willed gambler commits sacrilege against his own mother's corpse, yet possesses nerves of steel sufficient to endure interrogation while carrying the stolen brooch upon his person. This does not align with human nature as Poirot understands it. Their discussion was interrupted by unusual commotion at Marchmont House, where Mrs. Hartwell awaited them with obvious distress. "Monsieur Poirot, thank goodness you have returned. We must examine Sarah's quarters immediately. And there has been another visitor, a young woman claiming to be Sarah's sister." The narrow stairs to the servants' quarters creaked with resigned complaint as they ascended to Sarah's modest room. The space bore the telltale signs of hasty departure. Drawers emptied with precision, personal effects removed systematically. Yet beneath a loosened floorboard near the washstand, Poirot discovered a small envelope containing a torn scrap of paper bearing 2 hastily scrawled lines. "Side chapel. Before the service. Bring the word, or there's no second chance." Below, a single initial A. "Ashworth," Hastings suggested, but Poirot shook his head thoughtfully. "The vague letter serves many purposes, mon ami. It can be claimed by anyone whose name begins with A, yet the smear of printer's ink suggests medical or pharmaceutical origins. Someone summoned Sarah to the church before the funeral service, when the coffin rested unattended. Downstairs, they encountered the mysterious visitor, Miss Catherine Mills, a well-dressed woman of 30 with dark hair and confident bearing, yet her current demeanor suggested barely controlled anxiety rather than mere sisterly concern. She clutched a letter purportedly from Sarah, describing frightening discoveries within the household. "Mademoiselle Mills," Poirot said with courteous formality, "you bear remarkable resemblance to the mysterious visitor who called upon Lady Evangeline 3 days before her death. Perhaps you could explain this coincidence?" Her composure faltered momentarily, a flush coloring her cheeks as she fumbled with the letter. "I work as a governess in Hampshire. I came immediately upon receiving Sarah's correspondence." Lady Cordelia, who had been observing this exchange with growing recognition, stepped forward. "Miss Mills, forgive my intrusion, but you seem remarkably familiar. Have we perhaps met in society?" "I think not, Lady Marchmont. I move in quite different circles." The tension in the room was palpable as Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat with obvious reluctance. "There is another matter requiring immediate attention. The reading of Lady Evangeline's will reveals details that cast Sir Reginald's confession in an entirely different light." He consulted his documents with trembling hands. The Marchmont diamond was explicitly bequeathed to the National Museum of Antiquities to be displayed in Lady Evangeline's memory. Sir Reginald, in confessing to its theft, has effectively stolen from a national institution rather than from his own inheritance. A collective gasp filled the drawing room. The implications were staggering. Sir Reginald's confession now carried far greater legal consequences, suggesting either complete desperation or deliberate misdirection. "Most illuminating," Poirot observed, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces. "The diamond was never intended for family inheritance, yet someone believed its theft worthwhile. Miss Violet, you mentioned that Lady Evangeline was furious following her mysterious visitor's call. Can you elaborate on that fury?" Miss Violet wrung her hands nervously. "She said the woman was attempting extortion, trying to take advantage of her good nature. Evangeline declared she would not be blackmailed." "Blackmail," Poirot repeated softly, watching as each family member's expression shifted subtly. "An ugly word that often accompanies dangerous secrets. Sarah witnessed something significant. Her observation of the creaking coffin lid was perhaps more threatening than anyone realized. The comfortable facade of shared grief had shattered completely, replaced by mutual suspicion and barely concealed anxiety. Catherine Mills's connection to the mysterious visitor, the missing codicil, and Sarah's frightened disappearance created a web of deception that extended far beyond simple theft, motivated by gambling debts. Lady Evangeline's triumphant smile was beginning to reveal its true meaning. She had orchestrated a final game that would expose secrets her family believed safely buried with her. The tension in the drawing room had reached a palpable intensity as Catherine Mills's carefully constructed deception crumbled under scrutiny. Her claim to be Sarah's sister had been thoroughly disproven, yet her presence at this crucial moment suggested a deeper connection to the unfolding mystery than mere coincidence could explain. "Mademoiselle Mills," Poirot said with characteristic gentleness that somehow made his words more penetrating, "the time for pretense has passed. You were indeed the mysterious visitor who called upon Lady Evangeline 3 days before her death. The quality of your gloves, the confidence of your bearing despite your current distress, these details speak of a woman accustomed to better circumstances than a governess might enjoy." Catherine's composure finally shattered completely. Her hands trembled as she clutched the fabricated letter, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Very well. I did visit Lady Evangeline, but I am no thief, Monsieur Poirot. I came seeking justice for an old wrong." Before Poirot could pursue this revelation, Jameson entered with obvious urgency. "Inspector Japp has arrived, sir. He insists the matter is most pressing." Inspector Japp strode into the drawing room with his characteristic brisk efficiency, though his expression carried troubling complexity. "Poirot, my friend, we have developments that change everything. The brooch Sir Reginald brought to Scotland Yard. It's paste. Excellent quality, mind you, but not the genuine Marchmont diamond." A collective gasp filled the room. Sir Reginald, who had been standing near the fireplace with obvious distress, staggered backward as though physically struck. "Paste? But that's impossible. I took it directly from Mother's throat." The jeweler was quite certain, Japp continued grimly. The real stone would throw what he called a colder fire. This imitation is all surface brilliance with no depth. Someone has made fools of us all. Poirot's eyebrows rose with keen interest. "Most illuminating, Inspector. Sir Reginald confesses to stealing a worthless imitation while the genuine article remains missing. The psychology of this confession becomes even more intriguing." Lady Cordelia moved closer to her husband, her carefully maintained composure showing hairline cracks. "Reginald, what have you done? If you didn't take the real diamond, then who did?" "The question, Madame," Poirot observed quietly, "is not merely who took the diamond, but when it was replaced with paste, and why Sir Reginald was led to believe he had stolen the genuine article. Someone has orchestrated this deception with considerable sophistication." Dr. Ashworth's medical training asserted itself as he studied his brother's pale complexion. "Reginald has always been susceptible to suggestion, particularly when under stress. Perhaps someone convinced him that confession would serve a greater purpose. Or perhaps," Poirot suggested, his keen gaze sweeping the assembled faces, "someone convinced him that his confession would protect another person from suspicion. The psychology of sacrifice, it often reveals the deepest truths about human nature." Catherine Mills, still reeling from her exposed deception, found her voice again. Lady Evangeline spoke of people who mistake kindness for weakness. She said those who tried to manipulate her would learn what it meant to play games with their betters. "Ah, now we approach the heart of the matter," Poirot said with satisfaction. "Lady Evangeline anticipated not merely theft, but a complex web of deception. Her final letter spoke of preparations and precautions. That triumphant smile was not mere death's rigor. It was the expression of a woman who had set her final trap." Miss Violet, who had remained silent in her armchair, suddenly spoke with unexpected clarity. "Evangeline always said that secrets were like debts. They compound with interest until someone must pay the full price. She had been receiving letters, you know, anonymous correspondence that made her quite agitated." The revelation sent fresh currents of complexity through the investigation. Anonymous letters suggested systematic blackmail, while the paste brooch indicated careful planning and intimate knowledge of the household's routines. "Blackmail," Poirot mused, making careful notations in his leather book. A crime that requires both intimate knowledge and desperate need. Someone in Lady Evangeline's circle possessed information valuable enough to risk such an enterprise. Inspector Japp cleared his throat. There's more, Poirot. Sir Reginald has retracted his confession, claims he was protecting someone else and never actually touched the real diamond. The comfortable facade of shared grief had completely dissolved, replaced by mutual suspicion and barely concealed fear. Each family member now regarded the others with new wariness, realizing that Lady Evangeline had orchestrated a posthumous revelation that would expose secrets they believed safely buried with her. Tomorrow, Poirot announced with quiet authority, we shall examine Lady Evangeline's private correspondence and speak with her bank regarding any recent transactions. The truth, mes amis, it has many layers, but we shall peel them away, one by one, until only the essential facts remain. The lady who smiled at her own funeral was proving to be as formidable an adversary in death as she had been in life, and her final game was far from concluded. The morning brought a telegram from the Bank of England that would prove to be the key to Lady Evangeline's elaborate posthumous strategy. Poirot examined the communication with characteristic precision as he and Hastings sat in the morning room, surrounded by the scattered evidence of their investigation. Most illuminating, mon ami, Poirot murmured, adjusting his spectacles. This confirms that Lady Evangeline withdrew the Marchmont diamond from her safety deposit box precisely 1 week before her death. Yet according to all witnesses, she wore it to her final social engagement 3 days later. Before Hastings could respond, Mrs. Hartwell appeared with obvious urgency. Monsieur Poirot, we have discovered something extraordinary in Lady Evangeline's private study. While cleaning behind her portrait, I found a concealed wall safe that none of us knew existed. The hidden safe, revealed when the ornate frame had been moved for dusting, contained a leather portfolio that would reshape their understanding of the entire affair. Inside, Poirot discovered not only copies of the anonymous threatening letters, but something far more revealing, Lady Evangeline's private diary, its pages filled with her precise, elegant script. Observe, Hastings, Poirot said as he carefully examined the diary entries. Here we find the true nature of Lady Evangeline's final game. He read aloud from an entry dated 3 weeks before her death. A most disturbing visit from Miss Catherine Mills. She claims connection to my late husband, Sir Alistair, presenting evidence of a scandal that would devastate the family reputation. This is blackmail, pure and simple. I sent her away, but she will return. I must make preparations. The entries revealed a systematic campaign of extortion spanning several months, but the crucial revelation came in Lady Evangeline's final entry, dated just 2 days before her death. The situation has escalated beyond mere blackmail. Catherine Mills is not simply seeking money, she is Sir Alistair's illegitimate daughter, and she has a son. Young Arthur, now 10 years old, represents the true Marchmont heir. She demands recognition for the boy, threatening public exposure if denied. I've altered my will and devised a strategy that will protect the family while ensuring justice for the child. The implications were staggering. Catherine Mills was not merely a desperate governess turned blackmailer, but Lady Evangeline's stepdaughter, seeking acknowledgement for her son's rightful place in the family line. So the diamond was never intended as mere inheritance. Hastings breathed. It was a bargaining chip for the child's future. Precisely. Lady Evangeline understood that Catherine's desperation stemmed not from greed, but from maternal devotion. The anonymous letters, the mysterious A signature, the reference to the word, all connected to young Arthur and his mother's attempts to secure his recognition. As if summoned by their discussion, Catherine Mills appeared in the doorway, her composed facade finally crumbling under the weight of exposed secrets. "You have found her diary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then you know the truth." "Indeed, mademoiselle, your blackmail was not motivated by simple avarice, but by a mother's desperate love for her child." Yet blackmail remains a crime, regardless of noble intentions. Catherine's composure shattered completely. I never wanted money for myself. Arthur deserves to know his heritage, to have the opportunities that his bloodline should provide. Lady Evangeline acknowledged the truth but refused to make it public. She offered financial support in exchange for continued secrecy, but I wanted more. I wanted justice. And Lady Evangeline, being the formidable strategist she was, devised a posthumous solution that would expose your methods while potentially providing for the child's future. The genuine diamond, safely deposited at the bank, awaits proper disposition according to her final wishes. The revelation cast Lady Evangeline's triumphant smile in an entirely new light. Her final game was not merely about catching a thief, but about orchestrating a complex resolution to a family scandal that balanced justice, protection, and punishment with characteristic precision. "Where is young Arthur now?" Poirot asked gently. "Safe with my sister in Hampshire. I could not risk involving him in this affair." Catherine's voice carried years of accumulated pain. "I only wanted him to have what was rightfully his." The lady who smiled at her own funeral had indeed orchestrated her most masterful performance, ensuring that even death could not prevent her from managing the Marchmont family's destiny with characteristic authority and psychological insight. The weight of Catherine Mills's confession settled over the morning room like a shroud, yet Poirot's expression remained thoughtfully reserved. Her revelation about young Arthur's parentage explained the blackmail motive, but something in the precise timing of events continued to trouble his methodical mind. "Mademoiselle Mills," he said with characteristic gentleness, "your maternal devotion is admirable, yet one detail remains most puzzling. You arranged to meet Sarah at the church before the funeral service, yet you claim to have discovered someone else already present in the side chapel. Can you describe this mysterious figure?" Catherine's composure, already fragmented by her confession, showed fresh cracks of uncertainty. The light was dim, and they wore mourning black like everyone else that morning. I saw only a silhouette moving purposefully near Lady Evangeline's coffin. When they heard my approach, they fled through the vestry door without a word. Most illuminating. And Sarah arrived immediately afterward. Within moments. She saw me standing there, looking guilty as sin, and assumed I had been tampering with the coffin. I tried to explain, but she was terrified and ran away. Before Poirot could pursue this revelation further, Inspector Japp arrived with his characteristic brisk efficiency, accompanied by a pale and trembling Sarah, who clutched a worn carpet bag and refused to meet anyone's eyes directly. "Found her at a boarding house near Victoria Station," Japp announced, scared witless, but willing to talk now that we've assured her of protection. Sarah's testimony proved to be the missing piece in Lady Evangeline's elaborate puzzle. Between nervous sobs, she revealed that Lady Cordelia had approached her the evening before the funeral, offering generous payment for a simple task: to confirm that the Marchmont diamond remained properly positioned at Lady Evangeline's throat before the service began. "She said it was to prevent any embarrassment to the family," Sarah whispered. "But when I arrived at the church early that morning, I saw her ladyship already there, leaning over the coffin with something glinting in her hand. She looked up when she heard me, and her face was frightening. She told me to forget what I'd seen, that it was family business." The psychological portrait was becoming devastatingly clear. Lady Cordelia had orchestrated her own theft, using Catherine Mills's blackmail attempts as convenient cover for her desperate scheme to secure the family's financial future. Yet she had discovered, to her horror, that Lady Evangeline had anticipated such treachery and had already replaced the genuine diamond with paste. The fabric fragment we discovered on the altar rail. Poirot continued, producing the evidence from his waistcoat pocket. "Matches precisely the weave of your mourning dress, Lady Cordelia. You caught your sleeve on the ironwork while leaning over the coffin." Lady Cordelia's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. Her hands trembled as she gripped her handkerchief, and the confident bearing that had carried her through years of society functions seemed to dissolve before their eyes. "You must understand," she whispered desperately. "Reginald's gambling debts have consumed everything. The creditors were threatening seizure of the house, and Lady Evangeline refused to help. When I learned of the blackmail attempts, I saw an opportunity to secure our survival." "Yet you discovered that Lady Evangeline had moved the genuine diamond to safety, leaving only paste in its place. Your theft netted nothing but worthless imitation, forcing your husband to confess to a crime that would protect you from suspicion while providing no actual benefit." The true genius of Lady Evangeline's posthumous strategy was now revealed in all its psychological complexity. She had anticipated not merely external threats from Catherine Mills's blackmail, but betrayal from within her own family. Her final game had been designed to expose the full extent of the corruption surrounding her death, while ensuring justice for young Arthur through her carefully constructed will. Lady Evangeline understood human nature with frightening precision, Poirot observed quietly. She knew that desperation would drive someone in this household to attempt theft, and she prepared accordingly. That triumphant smile was not mere death's rigor. It was the expression of a woman who had set her final trap with characteristic brilliance. As the full scope of the deception became clear, each family member began to understand that they had been players in Lady Evangeline's most masterful performance, a posthumous drama that would reshape their lives according to her inexorable will. The lady who smiled at her own funeral had indeed achieved her ultimate victory, proving that even death could not diminish her formidable capacity for psychological manipulation and strategic planning. The drawing room of Marchmont House had been transformed into a theatre of judgment, with Hercule Poirot commanding center stage before the assembled company. Every face bore the weight of secrets exposed and deceptions unraveled, while Lady Evangeline's portrait gazed down with the same knowing expression that had marked her triumphant smile in death. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began with characteristic precision, "we have witnessed a masterpiece of posthumous manipulation orchestrated by a woman whose understanding of human psychology proved formidable even beyond the grave. Lady Evangeline Marchmont did not merely anticipate irregularities surrounding her death. She choreographed them with the skill of a master dramatist. His keen gaze swept the assembled faces, cataloguing each expression as the psychological drama reached its inevitable conclusion. The mystery began with a smile, that triumphant, knowing expression that transformed a funeral into something far more sinister. This was not the peaceful countenance of natural death, but the satisfaction of a woman who had delivered her final, masterful stroke in a game of chess played with the highest stakes. The immediate puzzle concerned the missing Marchmont diamond, yet the solution reveals Lady Evangeline's extraordinary foresight. 1 week before her death, she withdrew the genuine article from her bank vault and deposited it in a separate trust account, designated specifically for young Arthur's education and future welfare. The paste imitation that remained served as both bait and test for the corruption she suspected within her own household. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat nervously. "The codicil to her will provide substantial funding for the boy's trust, though she never revealed the source. I assumed it would come from her general estate. Precisely the impression she intended to create, monsieur. The diamond's value would indeed provide comprehensive education and opportunities for Sir Alister's illegitimate son, while its absence from the family estate would prevent those who betrayed her from benefiting from what she considered ill-gotten gains." Poirot turned to Lady Cordelia, whose carefully maintained composure had crumbled completely. "Your desperate financial circumstances, madame, combined with knowledge of Catherine Mills's blackmail attempts, created what appeared to be the perfect opportunity. The morning of the funeral, you entered the side chapel before the service, intending to remove the diamond from your mother-in-law's throat." The fabric fragment emerged from his waistcoat pocket. "This silk, torn from your mourning dress and caught on the altar rail's ironwork, provides physical evidence of your presence at the coffin. Sarah witnessed your actions, observing you leaning over Lady Evangeline with something glinting in your hand. Lady Cordelia's voice emerged as barely a whisper. How could I have known she had replaced it with paste? The blackmail situation would provide the obvious motive, and Reginald's gambling debts would explain any family suspicion. Yet you discovered, to your horror, that your act of sacrilege had netted nothing but worthless imitation. Your theft served Lady Evangeline's purposes perfectly, exposing your willingness to commit such desecration while providing no actual benefit to your circumstances. Sir Reginald found his voice, though it trembled with accumulated shame. Cordelia convinced me that confessing to the theft would deflect suspicion from her and provide a coherent explanation for the diamond's disappearance. I thought I was protecting my wife and the family reputation. Your confession, monsieur, demonstrated both nobility and naivety. You willingly accepted guilt for a crime that would have destroyed your standing in society, yet the evidence you presented, the paste brooch, revealed the futility of your wife's desperate gamble. Lady Evangeline understood human nature with devastating accuracy. Poirot continued, his voice carrying quiet admiration. She anticipated that financial desperation would drive someone in this household to attempt theft, particularly once they learned of the blackmail situation. Her solution was characteristically complex: provide justice for young Arthur through her will while exposing the corruption that surrounded her own death. Catherine Mills, who had remained silent throughout the revelation, spoke with quiet resignation. She offered money, but I demanded recognition. Arthur deserves to know his father's family, to have the opportunities his bloodline should provide. Indeed, mademoiselle. Yet Lady Evangeline chose a more subtle path to justice, ensuring the child's future while protecting the family from immediate scandal. Her final performance was indeed her masterpiece. As the implications of Lady Evangeline's posthumous strategy settled over the assembled company, each person began to understand that they had been players in a drama scripted with psychological precision. The lady who smiled at her own funeral had achieved her ultimate victory, proving that even death could not diminish her formidable capacity for manipulation and strategic planning. Justice had been served according to her inexorable will, extending her influence far beyond the grave she had orchestrated with such triumphant satisfaction. The profound silence that followed Poirot's exposition was broken only by Inspector Japp's measured footsteps as he approached Lady Cordelia with professional gravity. Lady Cordelia Marchmont, you are under arrest for theft from the deceased and interference with a corpse. The paste nature of the stolen item may influence sentencing, but the sacrilegious nature of your act will not be overlooked. As the constables moved forward, Sir Reginald stepped protectively toward his wife, his face bearing the pallor of complete defeat. Cordelia acted from desperation, not malice, he pleaded, though his voice carried no real hope of clemency. Lady Cordelia, her composure finally restored through acceptance of her fate, addressed the assembled company with quiet dignity. I want it understood that Reginald knew nothing of my intentions. His confession was misguided chivalry, attempting to protect a wife who had already damned herself. As she was led away, Poirot turned to address the remaining mysteries that had puzzled the investigation. There remained two final details that complete Lady Evangeline's masterpiece. First, the note discovered beneath Sarah's floorboard, the paper bearing medical disinfectants rather than printer's ink, torn from Dr. Ashworth's prescription pad when Lady Cordelia rifled his medical bag. She chose the initial A deliberately, creating suspicion that could fall upon Ashworth, Arthur, or any convenient phantom. Dr. Ashworth nodded grimly. I left my bag in the nursery when attending Miss Violet's palpitations. Cordelia had ample opportunity. Precisely. And Sarah, summoned to the church by this deception, witnessed Lady Cordelia's theft but was terrorized into silence. Poirot gestured to the trembling parlour maid. You are free from all suspicion, mademoiselle. Your courage in finally speaking truth has served justice well." Sarah's relief was palpable as Mrs. Hartwell led her away with promises of continued employment and protection. "But the smile, Poirot," Hastings pressed, "that triumphant expression that began this entire mystery, how do you explain such a thing?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with admiration for Lady Evangeline's final stroke. Ah, mon ami, this was her master stroke of psychological manipulation. Lady Evangeline left explicit instructions with Mr. Larkin, the mortuary cosmetician who had prepared her for society functions for decades. She demanded the merest upward curve to the lips, achieved through careful placement of mortuary wax and precise positioning of support bandages until the tissues fixed naturally. The revelation sent a collective gasp through the remaining family members. "You see the genius? To innocent observers, it would appear merely peaceful. But to those harboring guilt, particularly whoever had stolen or attempted to steal her diamond, it would seem like the triumphant smile of a woman who had anticipated their treachery." Lady Evangeline understood that guilty consciences would complete what careful preparation had begun. Catherine Mills, who had remained silent throughout these revelations, found her voice. "And young Arthur's future?" "Secured completely, mademoiselle. The genuine Marchmont diamond, safely deposited in trust, will provide comprehensive education and opportunities. Lady Evangeline's will ensures that your son receives his rightful inheritance while protecting the family from immediate scandal." She believed, quite correctly, that the sins of desperate parents should not diminish a child's prospects. Mr. Pemberton consulted his documents with obvious relief. The trust provisions are indeed comprehensive, including university expenses and a substantial settlement upon majority. Lady Evangeline was extraordinarily thorough in her preparations. Miss Violet, dabbing at her eyes, managed a tremulous smile. Evangeline always said that justice should be both swift and comprehensive. She would be enormously satisfied with this outcome. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot gathered his notes with characteristic precision. The mystery of the lady who smiled at her own funeral had been solved through psychological insight rather than physical evidence, demonstrating once again the superiority of understanding human nature over conventional forensic methods. "Lady Evangeline Marchmont," he observed to Hastings as they prepared to depart, "achieved in death what many struggle to accomplish in life: absolute control over her legacy and the destinies of those who survived her. That triumphant smile was indeed justified, for she had orchestrated a posthumous performance of remarkable psychological complexity." The fog had lifted from Mayfair streets, and as they walked toward their waiting cab, Hastings reflected on the case's intricate layers. She planned every detail like a military campaign, even her own death's aftermath. Indeed, mon ami, Lady Evangeline understood that death provides the ultimate opportunity for truth-telling when social conventions no longer serve their protective purposes. Her smile was the expression of a woman who had successfully imposed her will upon chaos, ensuring justice according to her own exacting standards. The lady who smiled at her own funeral had earned that expression of triumph, having delivered her most masterful performance when it mattered most, in death's final revelation of truth.